My excerpt is taken from Crime and Punishment, page 160 to 161, and in that, Dostoevsky writes, "You think I am attacking them for talking nonsense? Not a bit. I like them to talk nonsense. That's man's one privilege over all creation. You never reach any truth without making 14 mistakes, and very likely 114. In science, development, thought, invention, ideals, aims, liberalism, judgment, experience, and everything, we are still in the preparatory class at school. We prefer to live on other people's ideas. It's what we are used to." Razumikin states that man is to think for himself. You only learn when you fail, and it seems that with him, constant failure is constant learning. He even goes as far as to reward you for thinking for yourself, because in that, if you're thinking for yourself and talking your own nonsense, you're showing you're a nonconformer. If you were to be right in someone else's way, really be a follower, then you never learn, because he who was right has learned how to be right, whereas you who are a follower to that person are blind to how he learned, and thus you have learned nothing. This also can be tied to Kierkegaard, who says, "To dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself. In making an attempt to dare, you're venturing out of your comfort zone. You seek whatever there is to learn, and part of the process of learning is failing yet again. This is where you will lose your footing for a moment, but not to dare at all is to remain stagnant and not fail in order to learn. In not daring, you choose to be a follower and rely on the doctrine of others. It seems that it could be also simple to think for oneself, but in reality, Razumikin feels that people let other people do the thinking for them."
So I chose a passage from Crime and Punishment on page 417. It is when Raskolnikov admits to his crime. He went down out into the yard. There, not far from the entrance, stood Sonia, pale and horror-stricken. She looked wildly at him. He stood still before her. There was a look of poignant agony, of despair in her face. She clasped her hands. His lips worked in an ugly, meaningless smile. He stood still a minute, grinned, and went back to the police office. Ilya Petrovich had sat down and was rummaging among some papers. Before him stood the same peasant who had pushed by on the stairs. "Hello, back again. Have you left something behind? What's the matter?" Raskolnikov, with his white lips and staring eyes, came slowly near. He walked right to the table, leaned his hand on it, tried to say something, but could not. Only incoherent sounds were audible. "You are feeling ill. A chair. Here, sit down. Some water." Raskolnikov dropped onto the chair, but he kept his eyes fixed on Ilya Petrovich, which expressed unpleasant surprise. Both looked at one another for a minute and waited. Water was brought. "It was I," began Raskolnikov. "Drink some water." Raskolnikov refused the water with his hand, and softly broken, but distinctly said, "It was I. Killed the old pawnbroker woman and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them." Ilya Petrovich opened his mouth. People ran up on all sides. Raskolnikov repeated his statement. What's important about this passage is that Raskolnikov is setting himself free from the sickness, the mental instability, and the guilt that he has lived with in this whole book. Before he committed the crime, Raskolnikov was definitely dealing with mental instability, but once he committed the crime, it was exacerbated. It got worse and worse. It began to ruin his relationships with his life because of the bad things he had done. And what he really needed throughout the whole story was just to set himself free from that crime by admitting to it. At this very moment, he does that. He sets himself free from the guilt, from all the troubles. He walks out of the police station, but sees the face of Sonia, and instantly he goes back in because he realizes that this is what he needs to do. It's either he tells the truth there or he kills himself. And I don't think Raskolnikov, wants to choose that option. He wants to free himself by, telling the truth. As human beings, we want to set ourselves free from, I guess, the bad things that we have done, or the sins or the crimes we've committed. We want, by telling people, we experience some sort of relief, so we're not just, staying in our own guilt, in our uncomfortability with life, and by telling the truth, setting ourselves free, we're able to grow as individuals and acknowledge our faults and acknowledge our mistakes.
So I am reading an excerpt from Kierkegaard. It's going to be from Fear and Trembling. So on page 94, Kierkegaard writes, "The dialectic of faith is the finest and the most extraordinary of all. It has an elevation of which I can certainly form a conception, but no more than that. For the marvelous I cannot do. I can only be amazed at it. Indeed, if Abraham, the moment he swung his leg over the ass's back, had said to himself, 'Now Isaac is lost. I could just as well sacrifice him here at home as ride the long way to Moriah, then I do not need Abraham. Whereas now I bow 7 times to his name and 70 times to his deed. This he did not do, as I can prove by his really fervent joy on receiving Isaac and by his needing no preparation and no time to rally finitude and its joy. If it had been otherwise with Abraham, he perhaps would have loved God, but would not have had faith. For he who loves God without faith reflects upon himself. He who loves God in faith reflects upon God. This is the peak on which Abraham stands." So the peak that I think Kierkegaard is talking about here is sort of the space in between the ethical and religious. So Kierkegaard explains that people sort of have 3 dialectics, tiers, or levels that we live on. So there's the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. So in the aesthetic is sort of just living from pleasure to pleasure, and then the ethical is sort of living with regard to your obligations to other people. And then in the religious, you're sort of only living by what you believe God or this higher power wants you to do, or wants from you, or in this master plan. So in the religious, all that matters is the other, or the higher power. It's radical and complete communication with God, and God's complete understanding of you in response. So Kierkegaard believes that the only way to advance yourself is to go beyond the aesthetic and the ethical and to move into the religious realm. So in the story of Abraham and Isaac, what's important is that Abraham is experiencing the teleological suspension of the ethical, which basically means that the ethical, which is it's wrong to kill Isaac, doesn't matter because God wants him to. The most important thing is going to be God's master plan.
I'm going to read an excerpt from Two Ages, The Age of Revolution and the Present Age, a literary review by Soren Kierkegaard. The present age is essentially a sensible, reflecting age, devoid of passion, flaring up in superficial, short-lived enthusiasm, and prudently relaxing in indolence. In contrast to the Age of Revolution, which took action, the present age is an age of publicity, the age of miscellaneous announcements. Nothing happens, but still there is instant publicity. An insurrection in this day and age is utterly unimaginable. Such a manifestation of power would seem ridiculous to the calculating sensibleness of the age. However, a political virtuoso might be able to perform an amazing tour de force of quite another kind. He would issue invitations to a general meeting for the purpose of deciding on a revolution, wording the invitation so cautiously that even the censor would let it pass. On the evening of the meeting, he would so skillfully create the illusion that they had made a revolution that everyone would go home quietly, having passed a very pleasant evening. Acquiring a profound and capacious learning would be practically unthinkable for young people today. They would consider it ludicrous. A scientific virtuoso, however, would be able to negotiate a radically different tour de force. He would casually outline a few features of a comprehensive system and do it in such a way that the reader would get the impression that he had already read the system. And so I think what's really important here is that the present age, at least in Kierkegaard's time, he thought that certain actions weren't possible or weren't being taken. And on page 253, he even says the age of the great and good actions is past, and that action and decision are just as scarce these days as is the fun of swimming dangerously for those who swim in shallow water. And so he thinks that people aren't willing to live for themselves anymore and are starting to live for other things. And he goes on to talk about how people are being leveled into a kind of rounded off and maybe dumbed down as to not take action, and some of the things that are forcing them to do that are kind of their conception of humanity in general, the abstract, maybe the common man, and how if you ever try to attain that, if you even try to think about it, you can't even really hold an image in your head of it for very long, because everyone you know is unique in a very quirky and fun sort of way. But if we try and live towards a common man, then we get leveled off and we don't live up to our full potential. And whether or not that has to go on in our age, like Kierkegaard thought it was going on in his age, I don't know. But I think it would be good to be able to go beyond that kind of thing.